everyone, my name's Hannah and you're listening to the Brunel Let's Talk About It Mental Health and Wellbeing podcast. So I'm really excited today. We've got two very special guests and I will be introducing the topic more after you introduce yourselves. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about celebrating our differences, so equality, diversity and inclusion. Do you mind introducing yourselves?
Sure. So thank you, Hannah, first of all, for having us on this podcast. My name is Royona Mitra. I am a professor in the Department of Arts and Humanities, and I've also just been appointed to the new role at the university for Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. I think I got all of those letters right.
Thanks also from me, Hannah. My name is Mike Thomas, and I'm a senior lecturer in social work in the Department of Health Sciences. I'm also Associate Dean for Equality and Diversity in Chimels, the College of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences, and I focus on student-facing issues.
Great. I mean, I couldn't think of two better guests for this episode, so I'm very excited. Today we'll be talking about EDI. I think it's a topic very important to anywhere, whether it's a workplace or a university or wherever it is. And I think especially considering we have such a diverse pool of students in this university. I think it's very important to talk about this. And, I always say it's about normalizing things that need to be normalized. So I've got a few questions for you guys. We'll just go from there, a little conversation about EDI and what you guys think about different topics relating to it. So first off, I've been saying EDI. What does EDI mean? What does it stand for? Do you mind telling me a little bit about what it is?
Well, it's interesting because people used to think about EDI as equality, diversity and inclusion, but we tend to talk more about equity, diversity and inclusion now, which is quite an important distinction. For me, that distinction kind of goes to what we're all about at Brunel in terms of helping people reach their potential. So if you think about equality, you might think about equality as everybody having an equal chance to progress in their life. Whereas if you think about equity, it's more about people having equal chances that are more tailored towards their particular needs.
It's considering, each person's individual differences and stuff like that.
So there's no such thing as a level playing field.
Yeah.
Right? It's about making sure the playing field is equitable, that everybody has a chance to play.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think one of the things that I really liked about this university, as a student, I'm graduating this year, so I'm really upset to be leaving it because honestly, I feel like it's been such an accepting place. I've always felt at home almost. Like it just feels like I've never felt like anyone has ever been discriminatory or anything like that. I've never felt anything like that. And I think there's certain things that we've done as a university that I think has worked towards that. So do you think there's anything in particular that you think we as a university should be doing or other places should be doing to make EDI a bigger deal than it should be and make it more, known to students? What do you think?
That's a brilliant question. Can I just take a step back and add a couple of things to Mike's first response and then build on that? So I think that one of the biggest things about let's say demystifying EDI, in my opinion, is actually starting to every time pronounce the words equality, diversity and inclusion instead of falling into a trap of simply saying EDI as an acronym, because that acronym becomes a way of masking what is actually at the heart of what this project certainly means to me as a human being, but also as someone who's invested in questions of power and in questions of how we dismantle power. Now, if we think about what Mike said, which was that there is no such thing as a level playing field, absolutely agree with that. The idea of equality suggests that there is a level playing field, and therefore if everybody is treated exactly the same, they're likely to achieve the same outcomes in life. They're likely to be treated the same. But we know for a fact that different people are treated differently for different reasons. There are different kind of social positions and hierarchies that come into force, which automatically mean that unless those differences are recognized and bespoke needs are catered for those people, they're not going to achieve the same outcomes in life. They're not going to be treated the same. So constantly having to repeat the words equality, diversity and inclusion or equity, diversity and inclusion reminds us that it isn't just an acronym that is vacuous and meaningless. It actually has some questions of power that need considering constantly and dismantling as part of that.
That's a good point. I mean, we say EDI and you don't actually know what you're saying because you're just sort of saying.
Yeah, it's like a mantra, isn't it?
Yeah. That's a really good point. I should probably start saying that in the rest of this podcast.
but it's also understood that sometimes it becomes a shorthand for having to be able to have a conversation without getting stuck on words. And then the other thing I wanted to say was the idea of inclusion itself. Now, what I'm about to say might sound controversial, but I just want us to think for a second about the idea that when we say something is inclusionary or something is inclusive, from whose perspective is it inclusive? Is it the dominant center that is, in the case of institutions, invariably white, invariably masculinist, invariably ableist? And I can go through other protected characteristics on that basis. So if it is on the basis of those who are already holding that power and they're being benevolent and opening up their doors and say, here, let's include you, that's one way of thinking about inclusion. But what if it's about changing the terms of who's doing the determining of that decision-making process? So that's why I'm invested in questions of power, which is why this project to me is fundamentally about examining, as human beings, are we comfortable with giving up positions of privilege and being able to understand what it takes to give up space in order for marginalized and minoritized communities to take up space on their own terms?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of relates to my next question, which was, is EDI everyone's responsibility? And I think, that's pretty much it's like people in positions of power, are they willing to allow the space for other people to, should it be that they allow the space in the first place? Like, why is it certain people allow that space to happen? Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's quite a quite thin ice that we sometimes are walking on when you see certain things happening. But what do you think about this, Mike? Do you think EDI is everyone's responsibility?
It absolutely is. And in a way, thinking about what Royona just said, the acronym is unhelpful because an acronym is a kind of jargon and jargon is kind of insider language.
Yeah.
And when we use that insider language, we exclude other people who maybe don't even know what EDI stands for. Why would you know? I didn't know what it stood for before I started doing this kind of work. So it is definitely everybody's business, but we're in this position where, and maybe I'm an example of this, people are appointed to lead on EDI issues, and they that implies a kind of expertise. But actually, everybody at Brunel has got expertise of EDI. And for me, EDI is about fairness and social justice. And all of us at Brunel, we've probably experienced some kinds of fairness, some kinds of unfairness in our lives. We can see injustice around us. So EDI is really just about everybody being aware of that and doing what we can at Brunel and outside Brunel to try and tackle that.
Yeah. So then if we're talking about tackling that, what are some actions that we can take or we have taken? I know that I'll just like to say, so there's this forum that Mike was doing for EDI, which can I just say it was such a good idea. I loved it. I loved the idea of it. It was basically for students, any student who wanted to come along, they could come along and raise any issues they had relating to it, which for me, I thought it was a really good, because it was also anonymous, it was a really good way for you to raise points that you might have not felt like raising if you were to go alone by yourself, first of all. Number two, the students loved it. It was free pizza. Yeah. So, that was another plus. It was a good way for us to have a conversation that needed to be had. It was like, there were certain things that I remember, one of the suggestions was sort of like, subtitles on all of the lectures. And I thought that was a really good point. I love that point. I was like, I didn't think that how important that was. So what are some things that we have taken as actions? What are things that you think we should be taking? Do you have any ideas? What would you say? It's quite a loaded question.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that we're getting better at is listening to students and acknowledging that we don't have all the answers as members of the university staff. So, if I think back to when I went to uni, which was a long, long time ago, it was like the lecturers had all the power and the students just had to do their best and try and get a degree at the end of it, right? Whereas nowadays, I think we're much more aware of EDI, of equality issues in higher education. And we're also aware, there's lots of problems with things like NSS, right? The National Student Survey. But it does also signal a kind of a need for us to listen more to what students tell us about their experience. Yeah. So the kind of forum that you mentioned that we're doing in Chimels, it's just another way of giving students an opportunity to feed back to us, and do it in a way that's safe for them, and means that students are not too exposed. Because if you want to have a conversation, say with your tutor, sometimes the tutor might be part of the problem, right? Yeah. Most tutors are fantastic. Yeah. We do our best, but sometimes it might be an issue, where it's a difficult conversation to have. So for me, it's about listening to students more. It's about acknowledging the diversity of our community more and getting out of this kind of default that the universities run around, white European Christian, norms. And we can think about the closure dates. Is it a coincidence that the closure dates are Christmas at Easter? I don't think it probably is. It's difficult to change these things, I know. But, it's thinking about these things and just thinking about how some of the things, questioning the things that we do and why. And often if you question the things you do and why, maybe you can't change it, but at least questioning things might help us think about different ways of doing stuff.
I just wanted to follow up on a couple of that as well. I think that in my thinking, there's maybe two ways of thinking about your question. One is a more kind of ideological shift, which is what you're starting to get to, that we start to question, we start to challenge the things that we've always taken for granted, because some of these systems are sort of foundational to not just Brunel, but higher education in the UK altogether. And one of the ways of starting to shift that dial on thinking differently and challenging ourselves is to consider that we cannot really be speaking about communities. We have to speak with them. It's that kind of disability justice slogan of nothing about us without us.
Absolutely.
But I don't think historically universities per se across the board have done that. They've tended to speak over and about communities.
And speak for.
Exactly. So speaking with is one kind of ideological shift we need. And then accompanied with that, and perhaps even a step before that, is listening to, which is what you said. And listening, real, true, critical listening, requires people to shut up.
Yeah.
We have to stop speaking in order to listen. Otherwise, we're kind of hearing, but we're not really taking in, because once we start to take it in, once we start to reflect, that's where the possibility of change happens.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like an ideological level. And then you mentioned subtitling lectures, for instance. That's a real practical example. Another one that I see much more and more colleagues implement in their own sign-offs at the bottom of email addresses is including your pronouns.
Yeah.
It's just such simple things to signal to communities for whom these kind of changes will make such a difference, will matter. I know that at certain departmental level, induction programs are now starting to address equality, diversity, and inclusion as part of, when you come to Brunel, this is what the environment that you're entering into is, and this is what we expect of you. So those are the kind of practical things that I think we need to move further along with.
If I'm not wrong, I think Brunel does like an activity thing that you can complete. I think it was for different things relating to equality, diversity.
Which is it an online thing?
Yeah, I think it is.
I think
I did one of them. And I was like, this is quite good, because you're basically bringing it right to the students' attention. Like, this is something that we all need to talk about, and this is something we all need to, get educated on, which was a really good initiative, I thought.
And it's something important for students to understand in relation to each other, but also in terms of their interactions with staff as well.
Yeah. I mean, do you know what? I think it's something that I think is quite interesting to think about, is the idea of what Mike was saying before, and you were adding on to, is that students are given that power to speak. And I think if this university is for students, it's only right that students speak about what they feel makes them feel most comfortable, obviously within limits, obviously just understanding the different perspectives within the university. And I think that's a really good point. And it's really good that we do have these discussions about stuff like this.
But you know what? When we listen to students, everybody benefits.
Yes.
I mean, another example, we heard from neurodiverse students that the freshers' fair for them was quite overwhelming sometimes, because lots of people in a space, very noisy, lots of stimuli around them. So we've introduced this kind of quiet time in the freshers' fair now, which is, more inclusive of neurodiverse students, which is great.
Yes.
But also that's helped us think as well about the way we assess students' work sometimes. So for some students, it's not necessarily a neurodiversity issue, but for some students, standing up to give an oral presentation in front of a big group of people can be quite anxiety provoking. And, when we hear that, initially as academics, we might think, oh, that's annoying because I've got to think of something else. But when we think of something else, when we put the work in and listen to students, we come up with better ways of assessing their work.
Yeah.
Which is often more authentic, more kind of related to the real world. So everybody benefits from these kind of conversations and from listening.
Yeah, and you've just reminded me that during the pandemic, when so many of our very practically driven subjects like theatre, which is what I teach in, had to find ways of adapting to the online model, and therefore assessments had to also adapt to it. Some of the best work from students came from that kind of, you will remember this, from that digital mode of delivering where, things we hadn't imagined suddenly became possible, some of which we have now retained within the assessment procedures of the modules that we teach.
Yeah, I remember in first year, we had like a module which was interviewing skills, and I used to have quite severe anxiety, and I just remember thinking like, I cannot do this. It was like the one that I was most scared about, and I was like, I wish there was another way for you to like test that I can, do the same, like portray the same knowledge but in a different way. And do you know what? I thought there was something quite interesting. I saw when I was applying to postgraduate courses, there were certain applications that were actually asking, what have you done to contribute towards EDI? And I thought that was really interesting. It's something new. I don't think I haven't seen that before.
And the university applications?
Yeah. So I think it was, I'm not sure. I think it was Oxford when I was.
Right.
Yeah. So on the application form, it said, what have you done to contribute towards it? I thought that was really interesting.
What's Oxford done towards it? I
wonder. Yes. We could also say that, but yeah.
But you know what? That's so important, right? Because I remember back in the day, everybody was trying to put in something. Oh, I'm in the theatre group, or I'm part of the badminton team. All this kind of very individualistic. And often some of it was linked to privilege, right?
Totally right.
Yes, I've just spent the summer in France. Well, good for you if you've got the money to do that, right? But this kind of, what have you done for other people? What have you given back?
Yeah. Yes.
That's so much more important.
Yeah, that's why I think this question is so important, because it's showing your initiative in something that, it's so applicable to everyone. And it's just saying like, where's your headspace at in this thing?
Yeah, how are you serving the community?
Exactly.
Yes.
I think it's better than the questions of like, what are your hobbies? And if some people are saying skiing, it sounds a lot cooler than me saying I read books. So, there's like a different sort of way of looking at what the student does.
Can I just pick up on something you said earlier, which I think is a really important point? You gave the example of the interview thing and said, is there a different way in which I can show my knowledge? I think you hit the nail on the head. I think there have been very conventional, very, I would say, ableist, masculinist ways of demonstrating what valid knowledge is within university systems, because when they were built for certain demographics in mind. Fortunately, we have now much more diverse demographics coming into the space, but the systems haven't changed adequately in order to ensure that every person who's coming into the space can not just survive here, but thrive here. So I think your point about knowledge production is actually much bigger than perhaps you realize. I think what we need to see within universities is a kind of, I would say, a revolutionary revisioning of what knowledge is and who produces it and whose knowledge production is seen as valid, because we know that some knowledges are seen as more valid than others.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have done we've made some steps in that direction. I mean, if I think about Chimels, my colleague Laura Hills in sports science, she did some really good work working with students to kind of critically look at some of the kind of key texts that they use in her discipline and think about how we can make these texts more diverse, if we can find more diverse texts and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, we are making steps. That we've had the Liberated Library initiative a couple of years ago.
Oh, what's that? Sorry, I did.
So that was a really nice initiative that the library put on, where they purposely looked for texts and voices from lots of different disciplines from more diverse backgrounds, just to kind of educate staff as well as students about the diversity of voices that are out there. Because often, you tend to kind of focus on the same old white, pale, male stuff.
Often dead as well.
Often dead, yes, absolutely. Very, very pale today.
I actually think one of the ways where I feel like I've become more open-minded, I feel like I wasn't as much as before, as I've become more open-minded, I would say. And I'd like to become more open-minded, and I'd like to continue on that. And it was one of the reasons why I feel like what I think helped me was reading books from perspectives of people who are living basically just their lives, how they live their lives. And you just see a whole plethora of different people of different experiences. You know, there's books that I've read with people with different backgrounds, and it's true stories. So it's literally just them talking about their lives. And you really get to, I mean, as much as you can, as close as you can, as you try to, you experience a little bit of what they felt in certain things. And I think that's a really good way to sort of understand where someone's coming from sometimes. It's a good way to educate yourself.
And then yet another example, I think Royona's college were involved in this or led on this, the Student Success Project.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
What's this?
Yeah, so this was more than a few years ago. So this was probably 2017, 18. I don't know how much student communities are aware of the awarding gap. Do you know what the awarding gap is? Okay, that's is in itself interesting. Yeah. So the awarding gap is essentially the classification of degree that a student qualifies with across all universities. And again, Brunel is just part of that landscape, where the data overwhelmingly evidences that our white students graduate with more 2-1s and first class classifications than our Black and other racially minoritized students. And there are differences between those groups as well. Yeah. Black students are impacted the worst. Black men are impacted the worst. So this was, I think, a legislation that was brought in by it's still the same government, but back in 2016, 2017, where essentially universities were asked to look at this awarding gap and to look into the reasons for them existing, and then to work towards dismantling them, to eradicate them. The Student Success Project was the first attempt at Brunel to start to grapple with this gap. And I think it is important to say that even if it's a legislation, it's a gap that should never have existed, right?
Course,
just because there's a legislation, we're now working towards doing something about it, but it's a gap that should never exist. So the Student Success Project was a project that I was involved in at that time at a kind of departmental level, so from arts and humanities, where the department was given a pot of money to employ students from the different discipline areas, subject areas, and undergraduate programs within the department. And with these students, and what I did was I employed undergraduate students from each of these areas, and we worked together to undertake a review of reading lists and lecture content across all of these undergraduate programs. Yeah. And to come up with, and this was done with the view to looking at how racially diverse are the reading lists and the lecture content, slides, pictures are used, etc. How gender diverse are these, lecture content, etc. And what came out at the end of that initial review project was really quite stark data that no one could deny. It became the starting point of recognizing that what an amazing former student of mine once said to me: how can we be who we cannot see? How can we aspire to become the lecturer in the space when the lecturer in the space does not look anything like me? Yeah. And those are just some of the dimensions. So who's teaching you? What are they teaching you? What are you reading as a part of your required reading and additional reading? Was the early work that was starting to happen as part of the Student Success Project. And we continue to work on the awarding gap. It exists. It is narrowing, but then I think there's just a huge amount of work to be done, because actually the correlation between a classification that is awarded and what is taught in the classroom and who is teaching it, and how that interaction happens, and how that enhances a student to achieve, and actually more importantly, the dynamics that determine what they are awarded, is not something that had been thought of in the way that it now we are, really drawing attention to it.
Yeah. That's quite interesting. I mean, you know, sometimes I do, like what you were saying before, I sometimes do look like, because I love academia, and I sometimes get a bit disheartened when I see like I don't see a lecturer that look like me, and I'm like, okay, am I gonna fit in this space? Is this place for me? But then I'm like, if it's not, I'm going to make it, and if it is, I'm going to join it. You know, if it's a place for me, I'm gonna. But yeah, I mean, that's quite an interesting point. So I have a question here, and it's quite, I feel like it's a bit more philosophical. I read it somewhere else and I thought this was really interesting. What do you think fairness and respect look, feels, and sounds like at Brunel? It's a bit more open than the other questions, but yeah.
Wow,
I'll let you go first. I've been talking quite a bit.
Fairness and respect. So for me, it's interesting how academia and academic life has changed. So now, you know, with student fees, with the difficulty students have with cost of living pressures and so on. I mean, obviously, we have a contract with students when we accept their fees that we have to do our best to get them the best possible outcome from their studies. So there's a kind of an almost quite a legalistic commercial contract there. But I think it goes beyond that to a kind of a social contract as well. That, you know, if we think about Brunel's new strategy and our mission, we are allegedly powered by diversity. So diversity is a strength of what we do at Brunel, but we're also driven by the social mission, which is to, you know, teach, do research, carry out, you know, public engagement activities that will benefit society, not just here in Uxbridge, but hopefully with a global reach as well. So if we think about what that means in terms of fairness, it means we have to do our best to make sure every student can have the best possible outcome from their time at Brunel. And part of that links to the respect agenda as well, because if you're not respected as an individual, then that's probably going to have an impact on how you feel about Brunel and about your engagement with what opportunities are available to people at Brunel. So for me, these two things are absolutely linked to each other. We can't expect students to do their best and give of their best if they're not given the support and the environment where they can do that.
Yeah. And I think that's why, for me, the slogan of Powered by Diversity can only be tested for its fairness and respect when actually people feel that they are empowered within those diverse communities. So it's okay. It's one thing for the institution to say we are powered by diversity. It's a whole other thing for the communities that they are referring to, who are the diversity, to feel the institution empowers us as individuals to actually succeed, to thrive. And they're two very different things. And one is ground up, the other is kind of, you know.
I mean,
and you know, sorry, it is a journey, right? Because I'm a proud Brunel alumnus. I studied at Brunel in the mid-2000s. Yeah, I did a social work master's here at Brunel in the mid-2000s. And you know what? Back then, EDI stuff was completely invisible. I mean, just nothing much going on. I came to Brunel as a member of staff in 2016. And I guess I was more aware of it soon after that because I got involved in the LGBT staff network. But I think Brunel EDI has really come up the agenda. It's much more visible now. And the fact that our strategy says that we're powered by diversity, we're driven by a social mission, I think it shows that people at the top of the university really do take this seriously. But we've got to make that into a reality that where, as Royona said, all communities at Brunel feel that we are powered by diversity.
Yeah, we're empowered. Yeah, that's the.
I mean, I mean, that's. I think about the empowering. The place that I work at, every now and then the managers check in and they ask us, "Do you feel empowered in the workplace?" I think that's a great question to ask, and it's a great. It sort of sums up the main issue that you sometimes feel in certain places where, do I feel like I can be me, and whatever that means, whatever in whichever way. And I think that's a really good question to ask. I think that's really beautiful. Yeah, it's really good.
I mean, obviously, you'd want to do something with the responses that you get. Yes. And then it's really kind of closing the loop. But that's such a wonderful question to ask. I'll be honest,
I feel like the places that tend to ask that question
are the ones that will do it.
Yeah, that's the ones that don't actually need to because they've already created such a place like
because
that.
They've already thought about it.
Yeah, but the places that don't, that's when you start to go, they don't check in on stuff like that. They don't check in on do we feel empowered, which I think it's very important that you should feel like that wherever it is, if it's a workplace, if it's studying, wherever.
As you say, it's like being able to bring your whole self and not feel like there's a part of you that you have to hide.
Yeah.
I remember when I first joined Brunel, I had, I think my daughter was 2 at the time, so she was really young. And I remember putting up photographs of my family in the office. And I remember someone commenting on, oh, wow, you've got pictures of your children up in the office. I don't remember who it was. Maybe I've deliberately forgotten who it was. Yeah. And I just remember thinking, why is that even an issue? Yeah. That is my whole self.
Yeah.
I am both a parent and an academic. Of course. And I wouldn't, and there are other identities and social positions that we shouldn't ever have to hide.
Of course. Yeah.
For the purpose of thinking that by hiding it, it will get us further in our careers.
Oh, absolutely.
That is just, that's fundamentally wrong. So, yeah.
So in a more practical sense, if you, what would you say to a student who feels like they don't feel empowered and they don't feel, I mean, I think we need to ask this question. If they don't feel comfortable, they feel like they feel unsafe, maybe even, what would you say to them as action steps they can take and support that they can get at Brunel? What can they do?
I mean, there are okay, so there's the textbook response to this, which is there is systems in place like your personal tutoring system. You've got, so for instance, in the theatre department, the personal tutoring system is tied into academic kind of tutoring as well. So there's a module that is a core module at level 4 or in the first year, and every student has a personal tutor, and they meet up with their personal tutor in their group, seminar group, every week for the whole of their first year, and then every other week for their second year. So it's tied in. You see your tutor every week. So it becomes a system where you are able to have such close contact with your personal tutor if you choose to. Then it becomes a mechanism through which you're able to raise concerns and issues quite easily, one would hope. It doesn't mean that it always works, of course. There are other mechanisms in place within the institution. So you obviously have the student center. You have, I suppose your first port of call is probably the lecturer that you see the most, who teaches you the most, that hopefully will be someone that you are able to be honest with and seek help from. Having said that, I think that, and obviously there are anonymized sort of complaints processes and stuff,
do we have something like that in place? Because
we have report and support. Where students can raise concerns and they can, and it's anonymous. Do it anonymously, or they can give their contact details if they want direct feedback.
That's great.
And students can also report things, feed things up anonymously via their course reps.
Yes, that's the other thing.
I mean, one good thing about Brunel is I think there's lots of different mechanisms.
Avenues that you can,
You don't always need to have the direct conversation with somebody who might be part of the problem.
Yeah, which is what I was saying about the forum that we were doing with Chimels. I think that was a really good way to, I keep going on about it, but it was a good way to not feel singled out.
I mean, that's another important mechanism too, because we did the forum in conjunction with the Union of Brunel Students. And obviously that's another place for students to go for support. There's an advice and representation centre, which is part of the Students' Union. And they offer free independent advice to students about anything that's concerning them, that's related to their experience at Brunel. So we have student societies as well. If there's an issue for a particular community, we have lots of student societies. There are lots of different ways of asking for help and solidarity.
Yeah. There's something that you said about not being singled out. I think you raise a really important point. So often concerns are such that there's the power of the collective. There's a group of people turning up to speak about one particular issue, either at a platform like a forum that you described, or even just turning up as a group or writing a letter as a group. And I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there's a beautiful book by feminist scholar called Sarah Ahmed called Complaints. And
I've heard of this,
Right. It's the most amazing book because it does this kind of this amazing analysis of how complaints processes work within institutions. And the way they work within institutions, according to Ahmed, is it's designed to not always support the person who's complaining. Yeah. It's designed to protect the institution.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So one of the ways that Ahmed talks about getting round this system is the power of the collective. And the fact that institutions really are fearful of collectives, and they will not really engage with collectives. And that's what the entire book is about. So it's, yes, there are mechanisms, but there are also ways in which the mechanisms don't always work in favor of the people who need the most protection, who are the most vulnerable. And that's an honest conversation that I think universities have to have. Yeah. You know, I've been in conversations with Mike and wider colleagues where I've said, just because there isn't data to say that there are no concerns doesn't mean that there are no concerns.
Oh, yeah.
We have to ask, why are there no concerns? Why is it that it's not even appearing as a numerical value? It means we have a problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hugely complex and a very important question that you ask.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a bit more personal, but have you had any instances in which you felt like you felt unsafe, and what did you do in terms of equality or equity, diversity and inclusion? Have you had any instances like that in the past?
Plenty.
Yeah. And what did you do to sort of overcome or get the help that you needed?
I think what you've just asked is going to throw further light on the question that you asked previously in relation to students, but now you've thrown it towards, the staff end of things. I think what you feel capable, I speak for myself, what you feel capable of doing in that moment or just after depends very much on where you are in your career within the institution, whether you feel you're going to be believed, whether you feel there were people who witnessed what happened, and if they are going to be willing to speak up alongside. Often people in those situations, including myself, when it's happened to me, I've, kind of had to consider and weigh up very, very carefully, is it worth my further deterioration of mental health in order to raise this as an official complaint? Because actually what's the guarantee I'm going to be taken seriously?
That's the thing. I feel like if the complaint is so difficult that it's
that itself is the barrier.
Yeah, that is what the way the problem is. That if it's affecting your mental health, that it's so difficult to get the complaint out. That's what we need to work on, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the instance that I'm thinking of, which I will not give details of, was fortunately witnessed by others, and there were others who were willing to actually speak up on my behalf for what they witnessed. But ultimately, the system is such, it is still up to me in that situation to have made the complaint. Those witnessing it could not have made the complaint on my behalf. Yeah. And I question a system like that. Because it puts the burden on the person who's already in a very vulnerable place.
They've already gone through the whole thing, and then they have to have the power and the strength to stand up against it. It's just quite a thing to ask for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mike, have you... I mean, you don't have to say this because it's a podcast.
I can think of a very clear example. I mean, it was when I hadn't long been at Brunel as a member of staff, and there was a training course, and there were about 50 people in the room.
Yeah, it was a similar thing.
And the trainer made an explicitly homophobic comment, right? And I thought to myself, oh no, he can't have said that. And I looked around the room, and nobody was kind of batting an eyelid. Everybody was just carrying on as normal. So I went to speak to the trainer at the lunch break, and I told him what I thought about what he'd said. And I said that I wouldn't be staying after lunch because I didn't want to be in that kind of environment. And I remember going back to my desk and seeing my colleagues, and I remember feeling so angry and upset about it. Because first of all, the idea that nobody else seemed to think it was a problem, it made me feel like an outsider, and it made me feel like I was completely alone. And this disrespect, So that was a very difficult experience. And as Royona said, that when that kind of thing happens, the emotional burden and the practical burden is on the person who's on the receiving end of it. And it's very difficult to kind of step forward when you're in that situation. So what I would say to in response to your question is, when you're in that situation, it's okay if you don't feel you can do something about it, because we haven't always got the strength and the energy to face up to these things all the time, because they happen a lot. So I think the most important thing is to be kind to yourself about what's happened.
Whatever form that takes.
Yeah. Talk to somebody who you think will be supportive. And one thing to do, maybe in the moment, is just to kind of make a few notes about what happened, so that if in a week's time you think, I have got the energy today to do something about it, you've got some kind of record or reminder of what happened.
But that sense of inability, in a way, recognizing that, I don't have the strength right now, that strength of inability in that moment to do the right or do the thing, to do the complaining, stays with you if you feel that you haven't been able to do it. And for me, it's resulted in further down the line, further in my career, witnessing injustice towards other colleagues and speaking up on their behalf and actually doing something about it. So I think it builds over your career. And in a way, when you speak up further down the line for somebody else, you're also speaking up for yourself for the time that you felt you weren't able to.
Oh, that's beautifully put. Yeah. I mean, to wrap up, I would say, do you have a sort of last message that you'd like to have all the students and staff here who are listening, something related to what we've been talking about today?
I would say always be conscious of the fact that as a human being, we are treading through life in different relations to different power regimes. In some relationships, we are in dominant positions. And when we are in those positions, we are invisible to that power. So we don't even know that we are potentially harming others. And in other relations to power, we are in minoritized positions. So power is acting on us. And I think bringing it back to the work of equality, diversity, and inclusion, we cannot just get behind the struggles that are fought from the position of being a minoritized person. We also have to get behind the struggles where we are in a dominant position, because ultimately nobody is free until everybody is free.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think, gosh, where do I begin? I think I would say that most of the staff at Brunel, pretty much all the staff at Brunel, we have good intentions, and sometimes we get things wrong, and we often get things wrong because we tend to do things the way we've always done them. We're maybe not so open to doing things differently sometimes. So if you're a student and you think something is wrong, you think something doesn't feel right, try and find a way to feed it back to the university. Do it in a way that's safe for you and is not going to make the situation worse for you. But try and, if you see injustice, try and do something about it. If you look on the student intranet, there's an active Bystander page, which gives students advice about what to do if they see something happen that they think is wrong. And there's lots of different ways of doing it, lots of different mechanisms for doing that. So I would say, make it your business. Now, we know that students are here to get a degree, hopefully have a good time. And there's not, necessarily a huge amount of time and resource for students to get involved in stuff. We know how difficult it is because students are working outside of their study. But if you can do something to make Brunel a fairer place, talk to the university about how we can help you do it.
That's amazing.
Because it is everybody's business.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is very interesting for me. I feel like I learned a lot just from, forget the listeners for a moment. For me, I feel like this is very thought-provoking, and I'm really glad that we spoke about this. So yeah, I guess I would just wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Royona. Thank you so much, Mike, for coming. It was very interesting. And yeah, as usual, I'll always say to our listeners, if you do, we have the student centre. If you do need help, we've got student centre. We've got report and support. You said that before, yep. You've got your personal tutor. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.